I've revisited and reviewed the first two Spider-Man movies, so I thought may as well round it off, do a trilogy with Spider-Man 3. Definitely the lesser of the three movies, to say the least. But hey, I figured I'll give it another shot. I hadn't seen it in a while. It's definitely the one that I've seen least out of the three because I've seen it enough times that my memory of it isn't a pleasant one. It's not that good of a movie. But when I rewatched it this time, when I turned the movie on, I was actually surprised to learn, I must have been out of the loop, that there is an alternate cut of the movie, an editor's cut of the film. So I found that kind of interesting. I guess it came out a couple of years ago. So I decided to give that version a watch. I looked it up beforehand. Apparently, it's not too drastic of a change. And unfortunately, if anyone's going into it expecting it to completely change the movie, that's not the kind of deal. It's just, I don't know, a slightly different version. It's actually 2 minutes shorter. Tightens some scenes up a little bit, switches some scenes around, adds just a little tiny bit more, and actually removes portions of scenes and some scenes entirely, to my understanding. But having watched it, I can say pretty confidently that it's the same basic movie with the same basic problems. And the problem, I would say, is in the script and in the story of the movie. So there's not really too much that you can do in editing that's going to fix what kind of the primary problems of the movies are. So that's kind of the main shame of Spider-Man 3 is the story. And it's too bad because, I mean, in a very general kind of way, in a very broad sense, in where they take the characters and what they do with them and kind of the arcs that they sort of complete, I do think that they're on the right track with what you know they're following up with the previous movies. I mean, because with Spider-Man 2, kind of the big cliffhanger and what we all wanted to see with Spider-Man 3 was what's going to happen with these characters, like with Mary Jane and Harry Osborn both learning Peter's secret that he's Spider-Man. We kind of, we want to know what's going to happen with Peter and Mary Jane now that they're kind of starting a relationship, now that the secret's out, and obviously Harry has vendetta against Spider-Man, but now he's learned it's Peter Parker, and he's learned of his father, Norman Osborn. He's learned of his Green Goblin experiments and the super soldier serum and the gliders and the pumpkin bombs and all that kind of stuff. So we get to see that followed up with, and I do think that they get on the right track with that. Like, we get to see kind of the problems that Peter and Mary Jane have in their relationship and maintaining it, and that's kind of interesting in a general kind of way. And it is interesting to see Harry following up with his vengeance, what he's going to do, and what kind of reemerges in the movie that was definitely present in the first movie, maybe not so much the second one, is kind of that element of like a love triangle between the two. Because of course, in between the three, because in the first movie, of course, Harry and Mary Jane are dating and they break up, and like Peter's kind of staying away from her and that kind of stuff. But in the second movie, Harry's kind of just for his character, he's kind of isolated and focusing on Spider-Man and the company and trying to hold up his father's legacy and all that kind of stuff. But here it's back, and we have that kind of love triangle reemerging, which is interesting to see, and the feud between Harry and Peter, and kind of what it amounts to is that there's a threat that shows up that's just so big that Peter and Harry, they have to put aside everything, and they have to team up to save Mary Jane, to save the city, and that's where the characters are taken. And I think that's good. I think that's a good kind of plan for where to take this third movie, and all that's there. but I mean, the stuff that it adds on is kind of ridiculous. Like the problem with the movie is it just adds so much. It forces too much. Like we don't really just have the love triangle in the movie. We have Bryce Dallas Howard entering the movie as Gwen Stacy, adding as kind of a romantic kind of temptation to Peter. She's in it as well, and I guess I mean you can count Eddie Brock, played by Topher Grace, who would ultimately become Venom. In the finale of the movie, he's sort of mixed in with the whole love entanglement too. Even though he's supposedly dating Gwen Stacy, but he's really only like had coffee with her once, and he's like a psychotic stalker, kind of pathetic weirdo kind of thing. But regardless of that, it's all kind of intertwined and entangled and all that stuff. So that gets really complicated. Of course, they add a lot of villains to this movie. The first two really only focused on singular villains. With the first one, we got the Green Goblin. Second one, we got Doctor Octopus. Here, I do think it's fair enough that Harry wouldn't be, the primary villain. Goblin 2, I guess, is what the official villain name is. Fair enough that he wouldn't be just the focus. He needs a little something more. So they have Sandman, played by Thomas Hayden Church, and Venom, of course, by Topher Grace. It's very busy with all of that, and everything's kind of forced together. I think that's kind of the main takeaway of the problems with this movie, is that everything's forced. And with the first two, things felt balanced well enough and felt like they had kind of natural places for the characters to go, and scenes kind of went into each other in a sensical kind of way, and that's balanced well with the goofy stuff. Like, these are goofy movies. Sam Raimi does a lot of over the top kind of stuff in them, really kind of wacky humor that's thrown into the movies, which is fine, and it's balanced well with kind of the stuff that we're kind of supposed to take more seriously, the drama of the movies. With this one, even the drama comes off as kind of goofy because that's forced, and even the comedy feels even more forced. So it's like just the goofy cheesiness, much like the evil alien symbiotes, is taking over everything. So just the cheesiness takes over this movie too much, and it's hard to take anything really seriously about the movie, I guess, if you can say that about the silly comic book movie. But there were moments of sincerity in Spider-Man 2, which were highly appreciated, which we don't get from this movie, not at all. Definitely having a bunch of villains just kind of share screen time is a problem. They kind of come in and out at convenient times. Like, again, with if I can have a theme word for this movie, it's forced. Forced. They put this whole thing with Harry knocking himself out and going into coma just to conveniently set him aside for a certain portion of the movie. Then when it's convenient, he regains his memory and all his vendetta against Peter and all that. Even with Sandman, there's actually a large stretch of the movie where he's absent because we're meant to think that he's dead, that Spider-Man killed him, that Spider-Man turned to the dark side and all that. But then he comes back when it's convenient and all that kind of stuff. And the villains, none of them get any time to shine. I guess, I mean, in a really shallow kind of way, you can say that movies like this, superhero movies, are only as good as their villains, and I'm sad to say that the villains are kind of weak in this movie. I mean, we have Harry, of course, and we're invested to an extent, but I mean, he's no Green Goblin, right? Little Gobby Jr., you're gonna cry, things like that. Sandman, who, I mean, I can't stress enough that I think Thomas Hayden Church is a phenomenal actor. This is coming off a huge career revitalization with Sideways, which kind of brought him to basically like A-list actor status, which that's a brilliant performance in Sideways, and I think he does what he can with the role here, but we get all this stuff where it's like with the villains, Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, they kind of become victims of their own scientific experiments, and there's, I don't know, some kind of irony to that, some kind of mad scientist turns into a monster kind of thing. But with Sandman, Flint and Marco, who's for one thing, they try way too hard to make him this overly sympathetic villain where he's like, I'm just trying to raise money for my daughter, like, she's sick, she has vague child disease or whatever, and he's robbing banks and stuff, and he's running away from the cops, and he just trips and falls into some, I don't know, molecular thing, like some, I don't know, some weird science experiment. Turns him into Sandman, basically. Very, very convenient, and hardly anything worth noting any kind of irony about with the character or anything like that. Um, Even with like Eddie Brock and Venom, he just happens to be in the same church as Peter Parker, where he takes off the suit, and the suit itself, it's this hugely convenient thing. It's this symbiote alien goo thing. Everyone kind of knows it. I knew it going into the movie too. I was very excited, that they're gonna do the dark suit kind of plot to it, where Peter kind of turns a little bit evil, and that's kind of cool. They don't do a good job of it. It literally just falls from the sky. It's a meteorite, and it attaches to Peter's moped, and there we have it. I mean, I know in the comics it's some whole other thing, but one of the versions that I was familiar with that story was the '90s cartoon, which I thought did kind of a better job than this movie of getting that story together, where they had Jameson's son, who was an astronaut. He was on a mission, and they find this specimen, and they bring it back with them. There's a big spaceship crash and all that, and I was kind of expecting that because they introduced the character in the second movie, and he's nowhere to be found in Spider-Man 3. So you would think the movie would kind of open with like a big action scene like that, but sadly not. It's just a meteor falls, kabloom, and there it is. Um, pretty lame, pretty forced. And the thing is, with Peter kind of giving into his own darkness, doesn't work that well, because even at the beginning of the movie, I mean, sort of one of the themes they're playing with, again, with maintaining the relationship with Mary Jane and all that, it is his ego, where it kind of gets the better of him. He's kind of becoming big-headed. He's like, oh, they love me, Spider-Man Day, yay, things like that. And every time she tries to have a serious conversation with him, he always kind of relates it back to Spider-Man, and he's just unable to understand her, and her career as an actress, as a horrible singer in some stupid off-Broadway production where she gets fired from, and all this crazy stuff. It's a very busy movie, and then another forced thing, they try to tap into his dark side a little bit more, and reveal that Flint Marco was actually the killer of Uncle Ben. But then it turns out he didn't really mean to kill him. He was just holding a gun, and then his partner comes by, and then he shocked him, and kaploom, he shoots him. It's all just it's wacky. It's just such a wacky movie, and there's so much going on. Like, there are times you feel like you're watching three different movies in one, and none of them kind of mesh together in any kind of appropriate way that makes too much sense. I mean, it's there's just too much going on in this movie, and it's so stupid. If I can say some good stuff about it, there's good action scenes, I guess. Nothing that stands out in the same kind of way that the train scene in Spider-Man 2. That's kind of an iconic scene. Here, there's just some fights with the Sandman. It's kind of cool. Chase scene with Goblin 2, Harry Osborn. Special effects are kind of hit and miss with the movie. Like if you look at that scene with Harry and Peter kind of flying through New York and through the alleys and above buildings, it's kind of absurd. Like the some of the green screen stuff and like the CGI models are just so hokey, which I don't even I can't recall if they even looked that impressive back in 2007 when the movie was released. But watching them today, I'm like, wow, this is what they're doing. But then there's some good stuff. I mean, obviously, if there's kind of one moment in this movie that everybody seems to agree on, it is that Sandman creation scene where it's after Flint Marko falls into the molecular shabba who experiment, and he starts transforming, and like you can see like pretty much like every grain of sand was animated and it looks so good. So maybe all their attention was turned to that. That's where they spent most of the money on the special effects, and other scenes maybe not so much. Some of them really do. I don't know. Some of the special effects just don't really hold up in ways where the first two did hold up. So that's kind of a strange thing. Maybe it's I don't know. Maybe it is a psychological thing. I can't really say. Like maybe the better the movie is, the more you enjoy it, the more convincing the special effects are. I can't be sure, but it seems to be sort of the case with this movie, at least in some ways. But I mean, in other ways, if you look at the special effects, they're not fantastic. So I mean, it's all kind of about all this crazy stuff. Peter's dealing with his ego, dealing with Mary Jane, dealing with sort of a temptation in Gwen Stacy, and saving her from an accident, and kissing her upside down in front of a huge crowd, and making Mary Jane jealous, and Harry Osborn going in a coma and then awakening with amnesia, and then getting his memory back, and then devising this crazy plan to make Mary Jane break up with Peter's heart and then finally get him. And then of course, I mean, we have to have Venom kind of pushed into the movie because he was a big popular character, which Sam Raimi kind of claimed not to have liked, but then later said he was just saying that to throw people off. But then you kind of sense that maybe he didn't like the character, maybe he was forced to put him in. He shows up at the very end of the movie, and they have to do kind of the patented supervillains team up kind of thing, where there's just like a random scene where just out of nowhere the two meet, and he's like, "Hey, you hate Spider-Man, Sandman, don't you? Well, I hate him too. Let's team up and get him." And it's just so stupid, and this is big, stupid climax where they're up in a construction site, and Mary Jane is once again being held hostage, and the whole crowds in New York are just waiting there and watching, and the news is reporting it, like practically talking to Peter as he's conveniently watching the news station, like, "Oh, well, who can save this girl? Oh, I bet he can't do it alone. He better get help from his buddy. I know they've had their differences," and all that kind of stuff. And, finally he has to team up with Harry, and, there's the big climactic fight, and it's not all that satisfying. And, once again, Spider-Man, even before they kind of like established it with the Batman movies, and making it such a big deal with the Batman movies, one thing we always kind of knew about Spider-Man was that he never killed. He didn't kill the villains. They always kind of, well, they accidentally kill themselves. Green Goblin, he gets hit by his own glider in the first movie, and Doc Ock, he sacrifices himself to save the city from his big trillium orb that would have taken down the whole city. Here, he figures out that sound can defeat this evil suit, and so he, takes all these bars and makes large sounds, and then Eddie Brock is like, "Wait, no!" And then he jumps right into it, right as a goblin bomb into the symbiote, and it kills him. So once again, we have a conveniently killed villain, not technically killed by Peter, but I mean, good enough, right? Um, so there's that. Oh, and he lets Sandman get away. He's like, "I forgive you." Okay, great. He robbed a bunch of banks, but whatever. So there's all that. I mean, it's if you know, I tend to do reviews where I'm kind of rambling on. This one is especially hard in rambling on because there is so much going on in this movie, so many kind of plot threads that you know interweave and just barely make sense. So I mean, it's hard to put into words unless you've seen the movie itself, and unless you can kind of if someone described it in that kind of general way, like okay, Peter and Mary Jane, they're trying to figure things out, being Spider-Man and maintaining a relationship. Harry's out to get them, but then a new villain comes. They have to team up together. Generally that sounds fine, but they add all this stuff with the black suit, with Sandman becoming Uncle Ben's killer all of a sudden, with everything just forced together. There's no room to breathe in the movie, and it makes me feel so, you know, uh, I long for those kind of quiet moments in Spider-Man 2 where you could get away with, like, him just like doing his laundry or something like that. That'd make a really great scene, and kind of develop the character in kind of a neat way. Here, just everything's just forced together too much, and far be it from me to even have to mention, the silly struts and dance scenes and all that. That's been done to death. That's been, uh, mocked mercilessly. As is the reveal, which is actually one thing that's edited out of the editor's cut, where like the butler tells Harry about his father. I cleaned his wounds that night. It was done by his own glider. Should have told you that a while ago, I guess. That was actually edited out, which is interesting. Um, so there's all that. I mean, it's a hell of a movie. It's just it's a far step down from the first two, unfortunately. Which is not to say it doesn't have its fun moments. I mean, I'm not made of stone. There's good stuff. I mean, the Bruce Campbell cameo. I am French. Ooh la la. It's amusing. Good action scenes. Good Sandman effects. They do all right. Thomas Hayden Church is real good. Topher Grace is, well, actually, he's not so good. He's not that great in this movie. A poor Venom, I would say. Uh, everyone does their best. We got J.K. Simmons back. That's all right. There's some okay stuff. It's a bad movie, but it's a bad movie that I can at least get through. You know what I mean? Like I can get through it from beginning to end pretty okay. It's not like something where like I'll try my best and like stop in the middle of it. So there's that. And for what it's worth, I think Sam Raimi he did a remarkable thing. He is the first director to complete a superhero movie trilogy, which I think is pretty cool. And it does somewhat, resolve in an arc, sort of, which is all right. Ends with Peter and Mary Jane, and they dance, and it slowly fades out, which is an interesting change from the previous two movies, which ends on like these dramatic web slinging swoop into the screen kind of stuff. Slow fade out, piano music. Like he says in the first movie, this story, like any worth telling, is all about a girl. So it's all about their relationship, and I think it you know it resolves that in some ways. So it's all right. I have to say, I wish they would have done more with this cast, with at least with Tobey Maguire, at least with Sam Raimi behind the camera. which up until like the 11th hour was the plan. I think there was going to be a Spider-Man 4 with Vulture, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, but they went the reboot territory. Quite honestly, I'll take Spider-Man 3 over any day. Those movies are. I have no place in my heart for those movies. As bad as the Venom Dark Suit storyline, I still find it better than that Venom movie with Tom Hardy, which is horrible, which I stopped in the middle of. It was horrible, just horrible. So I mean, if this is a bad movie, it's at least entertaining, um, even as it gets very cheesy, very bad, very jazz club number, very emo Peter Parker flipping his hair kind of stuff. Whatever. I mean, it's a bad movie, but it's, I don't know. I have an affection for it in some ways. They're characters that I've come to like in the previous two movies. I wish it would have been better. I do find it a disappointment, but what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So, I don't know. I guess that's my review of Spider-Man 3. It's unfortunately an unsatisfying final entry to the trilogy, but a final entry to the trilogy it is. Sam Raimi, great job in bringing Spider-Man to the screen. Tobey Maguire, a wonderful Spider-Man. Some fun moments, some great special effects, web slinging. You will believe a man can sling. And that's that. That's Spider-Man 3. Thanks for watching.